Hi, I'm Oren and I'm a sound designer for games. In this video, I'm going to be interviewing two sound designers who worked on the recent Battlefield 6, which won Best Audio at the Game Awards in December.
My name's Yanni and Caldas. I'm an audio designer currently at Motive, currently working on Battlefield. Previously, I worked on Dragon Age the Veilguard, which came out last year. And before that, I was in more of the indie space. I worked on the Pirate Queen. I worked on Super Auto Pets. I worked on Rocket Rumble and a couple other small little indie projects before going into the AAA space.
My name is Michael Clarke. I'm a sound designer. I work currently at Criterion Games, and I've been in the industry for around 5 years now, but kind of working in audio for like 10 plus years or so.
I wanted to talk with them about their work in planning, designing, and implementing explosion sounds, not necessarily in Battlefield, but across all of their projects. I asked them both the same questions in separate interviews, and I'll be cutting between their answers so that you can get a more varied and informed view of this area of sound design. If you want to skip to a specific question, the timestamps will be on the screen now. I also don't normally ask for this, but if you have any of your own tips for explosion sounds, or have answers to the questions I asked that either differ to or expand on any of the answers that Yanni and Michael gave, feel free to put them in the comments below so that people watching this in the future can learn even more and this video can be an even greater resource of knowledge. So thank you to Yanni and Michael for their time, and let's get into the interview. What libraries do you recommend for explosion sounds or recordings? And are there any potentially more obscure ones that maybe aren't as obvious to people that you've used?
I find this is going to be very, very dependent on like the style that you're going for. Is like an explosion could be like fire igniting from like a magic spell. It could be like a cool ice explosion. It could be a rocket launcher or a car, whatever. And there's so many different things you could pull from. So I find it's best to not look for libraries that are explosions, but it's good to look for libraries that have the elements you need. Like if you're doing, I don't know, some type of magical explosion kit for fire spells and such, like look for cool fire libraries. Things like, let's see, Ember from Pro Sound Effects. That's a really good one. A lot of clean fire from there. For ice, Alex Barnhart has his Frozen library, which is so good. So many cool little like nuggets of like gold crystals, or not gold, ice crystals.
Boom has some really good ones that I've used quite a lot for more grounded, realistic, like explosion sounds. Like the Urban Explosions library from Boom is really good, and they have like a destruction library and a debris library that is amazing. More recently, the Mattia Chalotto's Cataclysm library is really, really good. It has a good mix of like really well recorded explosions in like a variety of spaces, and you have like the raw recordings, and you have like the processed sort of design recordings, and then you have a bunch of stylized kind of synthesized stuff to use as well for sweeteners. So yeah, that's a great library.
If you are doing real or like grittier, more natural explosions, I find the Recordist, his destruction library is fantastic. There's a couple Small Canyon explosions that he did, and also the debris in his destruction libraries are top notch. They take processing so well, where you can like hit it with a tiny bit of saturation and it doesn't feel like the saturation, it just feels better. And they're so good. And his explosion library itself is also awesome. Pole Position, they have their artillery libraries, which are fantastic, super clean.
Another library I've used a bunch that has some good recordings and also a lot of great abstract content is Penguin Grenade's Explosive Energy. It's got a lot of content that you might not think is like immediately applicable, but it's like, yeah, a lot of nice tonal elements that can kind of give explosions character. It doesn't have loads of like explosion sounds in it. It does have some. It's got like some fireworks and some cool, a couple of explosions, but it's mostly like stylized layers and electric stuff.
And you also have a Boom library. Their Urban Explosion and surprisingly, their Cannons library is full of gold. Cannons has some of the cleanest little debris nuggets that you can use for things. It's just like, oh, here's some like bunch of pieces of wood falling down or little like splinters of something. And there are very, very few libraries that have enough content or variations of it that are also recorded that clean. Cannons is like my go-to for so many things. Like, I honestly use it more for the debris than the Canon's recordings itself because they're just so good.
And another one I've used from Boom is brute force, and that's like it's very aggressive and very distorted. But sometimes if you need that extra aggression, it can be great to use in like transient layers and stuff like that.
In terms of stuff you could do at home, I find there's quite a lot of things you can use around the house to create an explosion. It'll be very, very hard to create a natural explosion at home because you kind of need the tail. Because the tail is like you can design a cool transient, a cool like mid layer, but the tail is where a lot of the magic happens, and getting that naturally at home can be quite hard. Things like fireworks can be great for that. Just taking like a firework recording and maybe just turning it up by quite a bit, and that's it. That can often work quite nice for creating tails. Things like if you want to create interesting transients, try taking like your microwave door, fridge, oven, just kind of slam it shut. You'll probably get a big like boomy hit of some sort, which can be cool. I've used a mortar and pestle. You hit them together and create a really rocky type of transient, which can work if you want something that's very sharp. And just like, okay, take your phone, go to something outside. It's going to be a noisy street. It's not going to be clean. We're not going to be going to RX, like none of that. Take that and just lay your stuff together. And you'd be surprised how many interesting explosions you can create with like very, very little processing and just being very thoughtful in what you're recording and the performance of it. But the performance is kind of everything. Because like going back to fireworks, a simple firework like boom is kind of boring, being honest. But if you hear like a lot of cool building reflections, if you hear like the little sizzle afterwards or like smaller fireworks happen afterwards, you can get a lot of interesting tales that way. And just like if you do have a library thing, just layer that in with it and add a unique flair to it. Because every single fireworks show is going to sound different. And like you change your perspective, like so many different things go into it. But yeah, there's just if you're going for real explosions, it can be quite hard to get that right at home. But if you're going for designed, you can kind of just go to town with it. Like even just pulling up like synthesizer and just having fun with like noise and distortion, ring mod or whatever. I think that's all cool. Just have fun with it. As long as it conveys the emotion you're going for, that's all cool.
How do you go about structuring explosion assets when making them, and what factors do you consider when you're planning one?
In terms of planning, it's just kind of looking at what kind of explosion it is. Is it like, is it something that's realistic and grounded, or is it something abstract or stylized? And then just kind of thinking about what kind of content that I'll need. And I'll kind of just do like a sound effects dumping pass where I'll just go through the library and just have a listen to a bunch of sounds, and then just anything that sounds interesting, I'll just slap that on a track, and then I'll just like have a track or a few tracks just filled with stuff that kind of might work, and then I'll kind of work from that. So then I can kind of separate the library browsing from the sort of creative sound design stuff, because I already have like a little mini kind of bin of sounds to use.
I totally get what you mean about doing the like dumping pass. That's something that once I started doing that, found it a lot easier to like really clearly separate out gathering the stuff and combining the stuff.
Yeah, I think it's like it's sort of uses a different part of the brain, and it's otherwise you can kind of get into the flow of sound design and then having to interrupt that to like go into the library, which happens anyway. But yeah, as much as I can try and separate the two, I think is helpful.
It gives you a clear point of like stopping just dragging new stuff in. At least for me, that's something that I sometimes have trouble with, is like when to stop just adding new sounds. And then it's just like you have 20 tracks and you realize that you don't need all of them.
Yeah, it can get a bit messy pretty quickly.
First thing is that you want to figure out the aesthetics before you do anything. Like, what kind of project is it? Like, how you approach an explosion for, say, something that is a fantasy or sci-fi is going to be very different to something that's going to be gritty and real. And even with that, you want to know, what is this explosion for? Is it for a key story beats? Like something happens and character gets injured? Is it just a core gameplay thing that's happening around you? Those type of things are initial questions that start asking and trying to figure out, which will help inform what the style of the explosion is going to be. And create. I find explosions are part of what I like to call a cause and effect, where you'll have the cause, which causes the explosion, the and, which is the explosion itself, and then you have the effect, which is the aftermath of the explosion. Like, this thing exploded. What does that mean? What does that do? And from there, you can start to pull in different pieces of inspiration and start to do little bits of storytelling for each of those. Like, for example, maybe you have the a missile gets shot. That'll be the cause, and the missile goes and it hits a car. The explosion itself would be the and the effect would be you can no longer drive a car. And there's lots of different ways that could be. Like, the cause could even be like a silence before the explosion itself. I think there's a Star Wars movie. There was like a really cool scene where it was just complete silence when a ship went into light speed and crashed into a bunch of others.
Episode 8, I think.
Yes, yeah. And like, it was really cool because absolute silence, you see what's causing it, and then you hear the explosion afterwards, and it's like, whoa. Even then, before you start designing, is this for gameplay or is it for cinematic? Because if it's gameplay, you got to think of all these other implications because of the implementation side and usability, where cinematic, you kind of have full control over the whole thing, and now you're going to guide the listener. For a lot of sounds, you may think like, oh, 5 to 10 variations, that's fine. For explosions, I mean, it depends on the style of the game. If it's something like a modern like FPS, there's probably going to be, I don't know, maybe 20 variations, for example, because they can happen so frequently, and you want everything to be a bit more dynamic and interesting.
In terms of structuring out the design process for explosions, I usually have a few different subgroups. Like, I'll have one for transients and one for the sort of body, which is like the meat of the explosion, and then one for like sweeteners or kind of like flavor. And then I'll have one for a tail to kind of put the explosion like in a space. And then I'll have one for debris, if necessary. And that's not necessarily for like rendering purposes. It's more just for kind of mixing and being able to like process those individual elements separately. I think I got the idea from a video on pro sound effects by Mark Hilborn on Gun Sounds, which is a great video. So it's very similar to the way he would structure a gun sound design session, but slightly different because we don't have mechs and stuff like that. But yeah, the same sort of idea. So it's a good video to watch.
Explosions are very noisy by nature. And so you got to be very, very selective of your layers and what you're going to use to create the explosion. I could try to see if I can create an explosion with as few layers as possible. Like, I find the sweet spot is anywhere between 3 to 5. That's usually going to be enough to convey everything you need. And I find as soon as you start overdoing it with layers or even processing things, you start to distract the unique elements between each of those layers that make the explosion sound cool and unique. I find it's very easy that when things get overlayered or overprocessed for an explosion, it starts to sound a bit generic at that point. So it just becomes a lot more of a careful thought process on, okay, what do I need for this element? What do I need for this element? Is this giving me the emotion I want? Okay, great. Let's use that, and it works. Then for the explosion itself, I like to break it out into about 4 different elements or so. You got the pre, which is going to be the cause. This may be part of the explosion itself. Maybe thinking something like the seismic charge in Star Wars, that cool silence before the explosion, like that's part of the explosion itself. Where something like a rocket launch and the missile going by, I wouldn't necessarily call that part of the explosion because that can happen from so many different things, and it's not quite the same thing as the explosion itself. The next bit of an explosion is the transient. This I find is a really great way to communicate what type of explosion. Like if you have a single transient like pop, that can imply that it's a very precise explosion. It's very self-contained. It's very planned out. Or you can have something that's a bit of a flam or a swell of explosions, like a ta-ta-ta. And that can imply that when the thing exploded, it was a bunch of little explosions that created the big explosion. And with that, you do have to think about how often this thing can play in a game. Because a single big transient explosion, like boom, 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 can get really fatiguing really quickly. So having flams actually helps for you to have still a really punchy explosion that's exciting to hear, but it's not going to be as fatiguing on the ears, which is something that's really important to think about. The transient is generally where a majority of the low end and the high frequency content is going to come from. And so you just want, because that can happen so frequently potentially, you want to make sure that that is very controlled. So I find little like swells, flams type of things make explosions just sound a lot nicer versus a single hit. And those are what you're primarily going to want a ton of variations for. Like something like just a grenade going off. Like there's so many different unique stories you can tell with just the transient. Like, did it explode cleanly? Did it explode like kind of like half explode and then explode? And like these are things that happen within like milliseconds. And a lot of people may not realize it, but if you go and like start like analyzing a lot of explosions in games, you'll notice that it's not always just a big hit. A lot of times it's gonna be multiple small hits right next to each other, which sounds quite cool. After the transient, you've got the body, which I find is where you can influence what kind of power the explosion had. Like you might be hearing, I don't know, the ground rumble for like a few milliseconds. You might hear some like distorted air movement, like the air like viciously being moved away. Or it could even be like the really quick early reflection inside of a room of the explosion, just help influence like how much power this thing had. And it tends to be a nice bridge between the transient and the tail. Because the tail is what can influence the effect of the explosion. It'll be, I find where you can do the most amount of storytelling. You can communicate so many different things with the tail, like what type of environments, what type of thing got blown up. You can communicate if the power of it by like if there's a lot of debris, like a small debris tail versus a longer debris tail can communicate multiple different things. And that's also where you can have fun with little like sweeteners of some sort if they're needed. Because the tail can be something that conveys so many different things, you can almost like have more fun with them in a way. Like maybe instead of like your simple, like you hear a lot of people do a tail, it's just like a ka, and then it kind of like decays naturally. But if you add in like, I don't know, maybe little firework crackles like ka, pop, 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 like that's like making things a bit more interesting. Maybe you're communicating, there's a different environment for explosion. And then each variation, we'll try and design different tails if you can. Just make things even more dynamic and interesting. I find when you use like, say, when you take like, say, a sausage file to create your variations, I find using the same sausage file for all the variations can be cool, but you end up making layers that all sound, or making variations that sound kind of the same. So switching out what those files are for different variations can help make things a bit more interesting and also a bit more dynamic in that way. So that way it sounds like this one pool of 10 explosions could really feel like a lot more than 10 because there's so many different ones and the odds of repetition go down like quite a bit.
When I was first learning how to make explosions, the tails were probably the part that I maybe respected the least. And now I think that might be my favorite part to make, because you're right, the environmental reflection, the amount of really cool tones you can get from that. You can actually just stuff so much character in there.
Yeah, it's interesting because something in like a game, you could have explosions happening and like the transient and whatever, like those like punch layers, like those are so short. They happen so fast, but really what the player's going to be picking up on a lot of the time is the tail because it's going to sustain for a bit longer period and you're like, oh, okay, that happened. Like you might hear the impact and stuff, sure, but the tail is what's going to like draw you to like look at something right away.
What kind of sounds have you used for sweeteners? And what are some scenarios that you would use sweeteners when designing sounds?
Sweeteners are things I try to avoid using, being honest, as much as possible and keep things as grounded to what you expect. I'll generally just stick to using a sweetener if it's some type of narrative beat that you're trying to hit, if it's some type of basically any type of cooler moment that deserves a bit more attention. That's when I'll get into doing sweeteners. Because if every explosion is sweeteners, uh, is sweetened, then it'd be quite hard to guide the listener on this one is more important, but it sounds just as cool as everything else. It can be quite hard to make that distinction. So most of the time, I'm trying to avoid any and all sweeteners and just reserve it and like keep it in the back bag and like, okay, this is a cool moment. Now let's do something. And even then, when you're doing something, I try to keep things on more of the subtle side personally. I know some people they are great at doing things that over the top. I just personally haven't been able to make that work, and I tend to keep things more grounded if I can. But for the sweetener itself, I try to look at what type of thing it is that it's exploding and what can be happening during it. Like if it's like I'll use cinematics for example for talking sweeteners because generally we're going to use it because it'll be more of a narrative beat that you're hitting. But like a classic is like a big like metal strike of some sort, like an anvil. I've like done sessions where I go around my office with like a piece of like a bed pole and I'll just like hit random things around, just get different resonances and little transient hits. And just layering like a tiny little bit of that, an explosion can help make it like pop out quite a bit more and like your ear will catch onto it right away.
It depends what kind of explosions I'm making. A lot of the time, if I'm just doing very grounded, realistic explosions, I'll try to stick to kind of those kinds of recordings, and won't use loads of sweeteners. But if it's like a metal explosion, for example, if a metal structure is blowing up, I'll take some like metal elements and just make sure that those like that metal tonality is coming out to give you the idea, that it's a metal structure blowing up, or wood or cement, whatever it is. Um, but a lot of the times, if I need help with the transients coming out, I'll use like sub kicks. That's a very common technique. So just like very punchy um, sub hits, like kick drums, basically. Um, and you can use like bass drops, like sustained sort of that classic bass drop sound if you want to give a explosions like size and scale.
Other things I'll do, something I learned, I think it was a Tone Benders talk with the folk on that worked on John Wick, where before this explosion will happen, I will add like a very low LFE hit just before it. And so I know like it's pretty common to have like the LFE come right after the transient because you get more of like that like kind of like a swoosh type of movement in the frequency spectrum. But by having like a little hit before, you almost make this feeling of air sucking in before the hit. And it's really cool and it works awesome. It doesn't work in core gameplay, I find, because it's like kind of weird. I'm like, where's this like bass coming? And all of a sudden, like it sounds wrong. But in a cinematic sense, it can be really, really fun to play with stuff like that.
I'd never heard of the method you talked about with the LFE before the hit. I was trying to think, like, have I ever heard that before? And I realized that in the Dune films, when they use the voice, they use exactly that. Maybe like half a second before, they'll have the lower track come in. And I remember hearing that for the first time and being like blown away by that.
But just like using elements that maybe you wouldn't necessarily expect. So get something that's a bit more different and use things that are interesting and convey an emotional response, but not necessarily because it's cool. Like sometimes like the coolest thing, or sometimes the things that feel the best are like seriously uncool. Like if something like a car exploding, I'll put in like a tire squeak, and like that'll be what makes it feel a lot better in context. I'm not try to refrain from like a lot of like low end hits because it kind of feels like I don't know. when you listen to those with like a sub maybe or something, just almost feels like a dance track if you have like a lot of those back to back, and it starts to feel like a oots oots oots. By refraining from sweeteners, I find you can be a bit more methodical on what the core explosion sounds like, because it should still sound interesting without any sweeteners, if that makes sense.
But like when it comes to more like stylized explosions, anything goes really. Like to give it interest and flavor, I've used loads of just random like sounds from my library that just looking for those kinds of things that'll stick out in the mix and just give it interest. Like I've used like electricity recordings that I've slowed down, just finding like interesting tonal elements that stick out in the mix and give it interest. It's something that you can put kind of like right off the transient or in the tail, just to give it a bit of flavor. Um, you can use anything really, but usually it'll be something tonal versus noisy, because the rest of the explosion is going to have like a lot of noisy content. So you want to have something more tonal that'll kind of pop out.
Also, I'm a big fan of using things like animals, being a creature fan. I'll see like sometimes if I want a transient to poke out a bit more, I might use something like a bird chirp or like a sped up animal of some sort, like right there on that hit, just for like a teeny tiny bit, maybe like 5 frames or something, or shorter, just to have a bit of an interesting tonal texture for a moment, just so it can pop out. But even things like tiger growls, like any type of growly thing can be quite nice for like the mid layer to help sell that there's a lot of like low end displacement of some sort and help add a bit more like movement and low end for just like a short maybe. Like these I'm talking like within half a second. You can have like these elements like come and go. If you're going for like, I don't know, sometimes like the whole bass drop thing I find is kind of a cliche and it's kind of boring. It's like pew. It's like okay, like it's cool, but I find you kind of like do a lot more that could be cool with that. And just like sometimes even like not do it going crazy with the bass can be quite fun. Because imagine if you're in a environment, you're listening with headphones, you're really in it, and then when this explosion hits, the transient in the mid of it, they like hit you in the chest. The tail being almost subdued can almost make that feel more impactful and shocking because it was such a quick burst of like, oh my goodness. I find when elements last for a long period of time, you can sometimes distract and take away from the initial impact of things. So sometimes trying to refrain from sweetening that can be quite nice to do and helpful. But there are times where it's what's going to work in context because maybe it's a really big important moment. Then yeah, okay, maybe I'll do something. Maybe I'll do some type of interesting wobble. This be like stuff blended in with the initial tail of it, so it's not like sticking out as a big thing. It's just adding a bit more of a interesting texture, just so it has sonically something a bit more different to it. Things like wobbles, maybe take like a friction mallet on like metal sheets and like you get that like groaning texture. Like stuff like that can be quite nice in a tail. It's like anything that's like got a lot of movement type of thing, like almost like thinking of it like a swell of some sort. I find is what's going to feel natural because when you have the explosion, you do kind of have an envelope to it, and using source or interesting sweeteners that have that natural envelope is going to make things a bit more exciting and a bit more believable. I find because I find I don't know, the more grounded and real something is, the more the listener can connect to it because it's more relatable. I find when things are super abstract and designed, they can sometimes be hard to connect with it and resonate with the emotional response because you may not have an emotional response to something that's super abstract. But like every person has heard a door slammed, probably. So like adding like something that resembles that can be something that's gonna trigger like a subconscious feeling on, oh, that was important. And even though it's something that's just so simple. Speaking of, I have used like a door slam, like in the middle of an explosion. So you get like the cool, like the lock, like hitting the strike plate, I think it's called. before it actually closes shut. It's a nice little fucha, and that could be quite nice to add into a transient, so it's not as direct and clean and punchy. Almost like making it unclean and punchy, I find works quite nice.
Yeah, I've used fridges closing for that because that had a really nice like
Nice.
when as the air kind of rushes out.
Nice. Yeah, no, that's awesome. Just like doing things in real life that mimic what you're trying to convey can add so much unique character and storytelling. It's just, I don't know, I think that's the fun part.
What are some tips when designing explosions to convey distance or proximity?
Yeah, so that can be a difficult thing to give explosions distance. I think like the ideal scenario is to find source that is recorded at the appropriate distance. Explosion libraries that have real recordings will have recordings from different distances, like 100 meters and then 200 meters, etc. So it'd be great. It's great to find those distant recordings to use as layers to give like a realistic sense of space.
I think the biggest thing is think about like in reality, when something is further away, how does that sound different? Usually it's going to be a lot less high frequency and a lot less low frequency. Like anything on distant is kind of just mid range. And things are going to be a lot more washy. Like you're not going to hear a super clean sound with like all these little details. You're going to just kind of hear the noise of it. And like thinking about that, I find can help convey distance quite a bit. So as something gets further away, you might get rid of the high frequencies. You might get rid of the low frequencies and just leave like a bit of mid range. And that can do quite a bit. But also, as something's more at a distance, you're going to get more of the environment. So they're playing up the tail, turning down the attack. Both the attack and tail layers, you might add more environmental reflections and make it a bit more smeary, add a bit more like specific delayed taps. I find mono delays can help do wonders at distance as well, because as something gets further away, you're going to hear more of like the echo of it. It's going to come from like a point source location, so adding more delay can be a mono delay can be nice. Even like things like if you have a transient, just making the transient less sharp or less transienty and making it a bit more of like a instead of a sharp hit, it's gonna be more of like a low thump of some sort. That can help quite a bit and help convey that this is now at a distance. Then also with that, like you don't need any close details. Having all these like high detailed layers and hearing all this cool debris, like you're never gonna hear it unless it's a massive explosion. You might get like a lot of displacement of some sort of debris, but it's gonna be like so low end and like mid range focus at that point. Like just like kind of just getting rid of all the details. That can like do wonders. Like it's okay for it to sound like kind of weak at a distance because you don't need to draw too much attention to it usually.
There's other ways you can kind of approximate that by using EQ. So doing like a low pass and a high shelf to kind of just take off some of that high end, and a combination of convolution reverb and delay is really good, or either or depending. Like plugins like Slapper are really good for that kind of thing. But I've had good results with like Echo Boy in combination with like an exterior convolution impulse response. And that can get you kind of most of the way there.
Outside spatialization using plugins is something that I find really fun but hard, like using delays and reverbs and stuff. Trying not to make it sound like it's just being run through a plugin, you know?
Yeah, it's tricky. It's a difficult balance. But yeah, I just got to play around with settings and different delay times, because it's kind of like, yeah, trying to get a sense of that slapback of the explosion, like bouncing off of buildings, and but without sounding like, like a musical delay. It can be tricky.
If it is for a game that you can like hear explosions at different distances, try designing both near and far layers of like the same thing. I was like, okay, cool. Here are my transients. Okay, great. Now let's turn these transients into far sounding transients. And maybe you'll like filter them. Maybe you'll just play with a bit of smearing, play with some transient shaping, getting rid of it, and then boom, play these now at a distance, and it's going to feel pretty good. It's still going to feel like the same explosion, and if you're like lucky, you can do like cool crossfades between the two of them. It's quite popular to do in a lot of games for like magic spells and whatnot. Just help make it feel like the same thing that happens up close. You can tell what it is at a distance because it has its same core identity.
And in terms of proximity, I guess it's the opposite. You want a lot of presence, and you want a lot of high end and tight low end to sound like really close and aggressive. So distortion, saturation can help with that, just to make it sound really like close and aggressive.
What are ways that you've used to make explosion assets sit neatly in a mix and not be too overwhelming in their dynamics or frequency content?
This is something that is very, very hard to get right. And I find the core of it comes down to being very thoughtful on your design. Like being very intentional about your layers, like using as few layers as possible. I mean, like I cannot stress how important that is, because if your base explosion sounds a little bit messy, undefined, you're in context, it's going to sound even more messy and undefined because anything could be happening at runtime. And then also try to think what can be happening at the same time in an explosion. Cinematic, great, you have full control, you can do whatever. In gameplay, it's going to be kind of tricky. Like, how are you going to make this impactful and still communicative at the same time? And also not make the mix muddy or fatiguing, which is quite hard because a lot of explosions, they could potentially be very noisy and be very hissy, be very harsh. Or really, I find for me, at least what's been working for me for things, is to have like way less low end and way less high end than you think you actually need. Like any bass and any high end is going to live in just the transient for me personally, and even then it's going to be very little of it because I just want that initial hit and then gone. Like it's just all about the mid range. And like I have a background, or like I came from a music background, and it's kind of always a thing where why a lot of people like to mix on those tiny little like mix cube speakers or on like NS10s, because all they would play back is the mid range. Because the mid range is what's most important for our ear to pick up on things.
Usually it's a case of pulling other things around it out of the mix to make space for it, either using automation or sidechain ducking. A good trick that everyone uses is kind of a couple seconds or a few frames before a recording to kind of pull out any sound, and you get a bit of silence. So it just makes it that more impactful when the explosion happens. But then otherwise is you can also control the dynamics of the explosion itself using compression and limiting. Multi-band compression can be really helpful to sort of control the low end, and some parallel saturation can be helpful to kind of bring up the perceived loudness, but without compressing it too much. Maybe a little bit of light limiting, but you want to be careful with limiting because it can kind of destroy the transient content. So maybe like a bit of limiting and a bit of a transient shaper afterwards to kind of make sure that the transients are popping out. But yeah, I think a big part of it is just to make sure that you're making space for it in the mix and taking out other things that aren't as important at that time. In processing in general, I find, like less is more. And unless you want to be really aggressive and do kind of stylized things, I kind of just, I generally just do like a little bit of kind of corrective EQ, and most of the time a decapitator at like 50%, just to give it a bit more crunch and compression, and then some multi-band compression. But yeah, like I tend not to go overboard with processing. I try to, in most cases, just make sure that I'm choosing the right source, that has the right kind of frequency content and the right presence, and then it's just that makes for less processing work and easier to fit in the mix. I find a lot of it is just in the mastering, so I won't do loads of processing per layer, but on my sort of parent track, I'll kind of master it as a whole, and that's where I'll do the compression and the corrective EQ and that kind of thing, and the saturation, and that kind of brings it all together into like a cohesive sound.
The simpler your project is, or the simpler the actual like construction of the design is, the easier it gets. I guess maybe makes it easier to kind of iterate on it and change, because you're not like having to deal with all this different stuff that you have to tweak or make variations of.
Yeah, totally. And oftentimes the less layers you have, the more sort of clear the design is. Whereas when you're stacking so many different elements, it can become just a bit like blurry.
Like, say if your explosion is a lot of tonal bits, and if it's a magical game, if you have a lot of tonal magical stuff in game, and then a lot of cool tonal magical stuff in your explosion, like that's gonna fight. They're gonna clash. You got to pick. It's one or the other. Explosions in real life are really loud. And in game, if you want it to be similar to how it feels in real life, like they're going to be loud. Like they're going to be like one of the loudest things in your game, probably. And so things like HDR can be your friend, but also just keeping things so tight. Like Helldivers 2 does a fantastic job at this, where their explosions are like tiny. Like they're like, I think like about a second long at absolute most, like maybe like 500 milliseconds, maybe. Like they're so small, because all you really need an explosion to communicate that there was an explosion initially in game is the initial hits. And like the high frequency and low frequency, they can live for like a couple milliseconds and then get rid of it. They're gone. Try to really see how much you can get away with just getting rid of things, like, and make things tighter and tighter. Like maybe like like a high frequency layer, or like the base of it, like maybe I'll get rid of it after like 2 or 3 frames, because it's just there and then it's gone. Because it's going to muddy up the mix at that point and make things messy. Especially if it's something dynamic where you can't have multiple explosions. You want to make sure you're leaving room for the next thing to happen. I find things get messy and muddy quite quick. I mean, this applies to all things for designs. Is that any type of sound that is static gets messy really quick for some reason. Where if you have a lot of like movement, even like really slow movement, I like to do things like you take a filter in parallel and just have the filter like randomly move, or like add like a formant filter of some sort, and just have like a subtle movement of some sort to add like a resonance just moving around. Can help add a lot more realism, make things a bit more natural, but also in the mix, it just makes it not take up as much space, because the space it's occupying is slightly changing over time, which helps make room for other things to come in and poke out, which can be great.
The movement thing is something I've really found helps. I think to talk on Tunic, Kevin Regami, his F-Mod stuff, and one of the things that really kind of, at the time I'd never really thought of, is there was some kind of metal hit. He had it so that every time it played back, it randomized 2 different notches, and he had either no or very few variations of the actual sound. He kept playing it back and it sounded like a completely new sound every time, because spectrally it was so different.
Yeah, it's crazy. Like anything like vehicles, like movement, like any type of sustained sound or even short sound, movement is your best friend. And if you can get really good at adding movement, your designs will be top notch every time.
Being very selective with your layers and what part of the frequency spectrum you want them to occupy. A lot of people kind of structure their sound design in like high, mids, and lows. And I don't really do that in terms of like my Reaper, setup, but I do just like, I keep it in mind. And I'm like, this layer is a tonal layer for, just the mid interest. So I'm going to high pass everything until like, 500 hertz. And this other layer is where I want more of my low end, and I don't need any of the high end in that layer. So just kind of making sure that you're sort of pre-mixing different elements, so you don't get loads of build-up.
Something like HDR can be your friend, or even any type of project really, where if you have like a priority type of system, where like when explosion happens, get rid of everything else for a couple milliseconds, because they're not important at that beat. But like little things like that can help quite a bit, and it's so common to do in games. Like the God of War games are actually any of the Sony projects, they're so clean in the mix and brilliant. And they're just very careful on what's playing at any given moment. So like if something is happening, you get rid of it. You get rid of anything else that's not important. Just keep the most important things playing. Like if something is happening in the distance and there's a close-up explosion, get rid of the distance thing. It's fine. Get rid of it. It's fine. No one's gonna notice. And just being very careful with stuff like that and just being very selective, I find, is what works best.
How do you convey emotion through explosion sounds?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. It kind of depends on the context, but a lot of the time with explosions, you're trying to express the danger of them and the impact and the aggression. And a lot of the time, I'll just do that with kind of how I shape my transients, my use of distortion and saturation. So if it's like a really close explosion that is really like having a huge dangerous impact, then I'll bring up the distortion mix up a little bit and get more of that sort of high end. And if you want to make it sound more huge and like a bigger scale, you can do like what I mentioned with adding sub drops. So you just get that sense of the scale and how massive it is. Yeah, I mean, it's tricky. Explosions don't have a huge range of emotions. It's either like very scary or relatively a little bit scary. But yeah, it's just using that use of distortion and sub bass. You can't have loads of low end all the time, so you got to make that decision of like when to bring out the sub bass, when to hold it back. So for those important moments, that's where you really want to get that low end in there. And the same thing with high end. And so like if you've got loads of explosions going on, the ones that are a little bit further back, you can pull out the high end a bit, and the ones that are kind of more dangerous, that's where you bring out the high end and the aggression and the distortion. So you just got to play with perspective and where you want that danger and impact to really come through. But yeah, of course, there's loads of explosions that you're causing, and yeah, you want those to be satisfying. Yeah, you want to feel like if you want to give the player like a sense of power, that's a big thing you can do with explosions and the low end.
I think it just comes back to your design where you want every single element and layer to be very intentional. Like think about every layer before you add it in, and think about why it's there and what's purpose is it serving, and be very selective in how many layers you may have. There's a lot of different like layers and like recordings and such. They have their own interesting stories being told with them. Something I was talking about before, when you have the transient that hits, depending on how sharp or how much of a swell that transient is, you can communicate a bunch of different stories like right then and there within like a couple milliseconds. And then you jump to the tail end, there's so many different things that you can go and convey at that point just by playing with different stuff that's that resonates with you. That, like, say, going back to fireworks, for example, like if you use like I don't know how to describe it, but some fireworks just sound really happy. Like it feels joyful. It brings me back to like you're a kid. It's like the like New Year's Day or whatever, and like, oh, that's like something you remember. Because not all explosions have to be something that's dangerous. Not all explosions have to be something that's threatening. Some explosions could be a good thing. Like maybe you just accomplished something and you're hearing, I don't know, the boss is coming crashing down. You're hearing like the building collapse. And you're like, yeah, I did it. This is something that's rewarding. Maybe you're going to pull some type of recording that you had that conveys like this happy feeling and add that into an element of your explosion. So it's going to feel subconsciously happy. If that makes sense. I find that just being very, very selective as to what you are using and picking sounds and recordings that mean something to you is where a lot of it's going to come from, being honest. If you like grab stuff because it's cool but it doesn't make you feel anything, then I don't think those are worth using.
The threshold for at what point you start really feeling an emotion from a sound is a lot lower than I assume it is. Because you're absolutely right that I've heard recordings and I've gone, oh, that's a really angry recording, that's a really happy one, that's a really sad one. And you think, well, I can't you can't always necessarily identify what it is, and sometimes you can be something really subtle. But yeah, I guess if it subconsciously conveys something to you, it will probably do that for other people as well.
And just like try to think away from how do I get something that sounds cool? Because when you get things that are all sounding cool, you can sometimes lose what the emotional impact is and how it makes you feel. So I think that's kind of the most important part, being honest with you. Like, that goes to like any piece of sound design, like UI, ambience, creature, even Foley, anything. How does it make you feel? Like if someone's walking, like if you've heard, I mean, a lot of people have heard someone walk before. And like how someone walks is going to convey, like, are they angry when they're walking? You know what an angry walk sounds like. If someone is very joyful, they're skipping a little bit. Like, you know how that feels. So like maybe you're going to take that little happy walk and use like their shoes like hitting the ground as like a click that's being part of your explosion, for example, because it's going to convey that same emotion. But if someone's like stomping and you want the explosion to feel more angry, maybe just add in like an angry stomp in there, and it's going to give you that emotional connection that way.
You have to remember at the core, like, why the sound is in the game,
Yeah.
rather than
Yeah,
get
exactly.
sucked up
Like,
into thinking, I'm going to make a sound, the sound's going to be really cool. But like, why are you making that sound in the first place?
exactly. That's exactly it. Like, what is the purpose? Like, if it doesn't have a purpose, does it need a sound? So using stuff that's going to have that connection is just going to help enforce that. And yeah, I think that's where the magic of a lot of sound design is, being honest. It's something that it's just all by feel. I don't know how to teach it to someone or how to tell someone what it is, but you know it when you feel it. Like, if anything happens at any point in your day that makes you feel something, write it down, record it if you can, and just like save that, put it in your library, add metadata that says what the emotion is, and then just use that as reference. Even like, you don't even have to use that as part of your design, but just be like, why, when you listen back to something, think of it almost critical at that point. Be like, why does this make me feel sad? Why does this make me feel scared? And then from there, be like, oh, this element about it is what's making me feel scared. Now that I have to work on something that's supposed to scare the player, I have a reference to look at and pull from. And it could be something completely different. Thing like maybe a dog barking. And like when the dog barked for that first time, you caught you off guard, and you're like, oh, look, you're actually really cute. But that initial thing, be like, why did that startle you? Like, was it because it was quiet before? Like, use stuff like that and pull from it and use it in your designs, and it'll just make anything you're doing sound really good.
You were saying how you wouldn't know how to teach that to someone, but I guess the thing to say would be like, just listen more and pay more attention and try and keep track of the things that catch your attention.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because what is scary to one person is not scary to another person. Yeah, just like what you're saying, just keep listening and keep logging and just writing things down, keep recording things and be like, how does this make you feel? And it can be completely different how it makes someone else feel. Like, that's fine. That's normal. That's actually good. Because if everyone felt the same about everything, things would be quite boring. And there wouldn't be any chance for excitement to be like, oh, that's an interesting experience. I've never experienced that before. But to another person, that could be normal. And I don't know. I think that's just where a lot of magic on what it is to be an audio designer. Like, we don't create sounds, I find. We're just creating emotional responses to things. And I think if you apply something like that to anything, like, you're going to do a lot of great stuff. When you call attention to a sound and like guide the player, like, oh, listen to this. This is important. You hear an enemy or whatever. Like, it's triggering like a fear response to be like, oh, I don't want to lose. I have a great kill streak going. I don't want to lose that. Like, that's like an adrenaline emotional response. And that's why you might be designing things in a certain way to help communicate and help convey that, so players stay in that emotional state. Because it doesn't have to be a high adrenaline state. It could be like even like a really cozy state. Like, if someone's like vibing out while playing the thing, just do sounds that are going to help them vibe out. Don't do something that's going to like not serve a purpose and like, whatever. Like, just make it feel good. And that's all, which is really hard because it's so hard to tell someone how to do that because it's going to be so different for every single person. But I think that's kind of the most important thing when it comes to designing anything, being honest with you.
So that was all the questions I had for this interview. I want to thank Yanni and Michael again for their time and insight. I know I learned a lot, and hopefully you can walk away with some new things to try and maybe a few new libraries for your wish list. Thanks for watching.